Welcome back. You're still watching Newsfeed PM, the late edition. Let's get into our panel for the evening. So Parliament's Joint Constitutional Review Committee is calling on the public to make submissions on the annual review of the Constitution. Now, some have called for certain sections to be changed for redress purposes, while others have called for the scrapping of the Constitution. We'll be hearing different perspectives on this discussion, and for that, we are joined by South Africans for Constitutional Reform's Princey Mtombeni. She's in studio with us. Also in studio with us is FW de Klerk Constitutional Advancement Manager Ismail Jisab in studio with us. On video link, we are joined by former African Peer Review Mechanism CEO, Professor Eddie Maloka, and, of course, UNISA's Department of Political Sciences, Professor Dirk Kotza. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. It's such an important discussion. But, Professor Kotza, I do want to start with you and perhaps help us set the tone on this one. Share with us your view on the importance of this, this annual review of the Constitution, if it has any legs, but also just the timing of this review. Certainly what it would have looked like 10 years ago, quite different to the sort of debates that you've got taking place in the country today around how South Africans view the Constitution.
Yes, good evening. This is indeed so. This is in terms of the Constitution. This committee must give the opportunity to the public to submit actually some ideas or proposals about possible changes or amendments to the Constitution. So it's an annual process. In most instances, it does not produce anything. So it is just a procedural going through the motions almost. But as you indicated now, we know very well that, for example, the controversies where parties said last year with the elections that their proposal or their position is that the Constitution must be abolished or withdrawn and be changed by a new dispensation. The Constitution itself hasn't been amended a lot. There's 18 amendments to the Constitution so far. There's 2 bills. One is a very interesting one that deals with the regularity of motions of no confidence. But between 2012 and 2023, no constitutional amendments were made. So what we are actually seeing is that it is a relatively rare occasion to see amendments. The one that caught a lot of attention was that about Section 25, about property rights, and then especially the expropriation of land. That wasn't successful. So that is why there is, I would say, up to now, relatively few changes made to the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, the timing, of course, quite something when you look at 2025. And Princey, this is where I bring you in, because you've actually been doing quite a bit of work on social media with South Africans for Constitutional Reform. So talk to us about what it is that you're looking to do with that structure. But you've been making calls on social media, on platforms like TikTok, to say, young and old, make your submissions.
That's true, Anna Lady. You know, our Constitution was born in a moment of hope and healing. And now, 30 years later, South Africans are demanding more than just symbolic promises. They are demanding a Constitution that prioritizes South African citizens. And as South Africans for Constitutional Reform, which is a civic body that was established for the purpose of this project, we are calling for a Constitution that the review of the preamble that says South Africa belongs to its own citizens, not everyone who lives in it, like it currently says. We are also saying we are calling for the protection of mineral resources for national development. We want our mineral resources, minerals, marine resources, water power to benefit the state, to benefit people. We also want South Africans to elect their own presidents. We want to do away with party lists and to enforce the democratic rights as well as the fair representation. So South Africans want to elect their own president as well as the members of the parliament. But we're also calling for capital punishment for heinous crimes such as rape, serial murder, treason, and among others. And we want the public resources, public services to benefit South African citizens. Because currently the Constitution says things like housing, free education, healthcare services, they belong to everyone. Yes, in principle that's noble, but in practical, it stretches the already overstretched government resources, and it dilutes the government's core responsibility towards its citizens. We are also calling for right to employment. You know, this country has the highest unemployment rate, and the Constitution doesn't have the right for employment, so it doesn't empower the government to come up with a project that will create more employment, or to even create the conducive environment for businesses to thrive in this country. Lastly, we are calling for the regulation of non-government organizations, NGOs and NPOs. We all understand that NGOs and NPOs are doing a crucial work, but we need their operations to be aligned with national development priorities, especially when foreign funding is included now, so that we protect the sovereignty of this country.
Sure, that's quite a list that you've got there, Princey. Quite a lengthy list. I must say I am struck by the very beginning when you say, let's start already with the preamble that says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and you say, no, it should say?
It belongs to South African, it belongs to its own citizens, not just anyone who happens to be here.
Interesting. Ismail, thank you so much for joining us as well. You know, Ismail, of course, is Manager of Constitutional Advancement at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. And your foundation, I think, particularly interesting because, you know, former President F.W. de Klerk being such an incredibly important role in that transition of South Africa from apartheid into democracy, and then just years later, the drafting of this all-important document. As the foundation, as you continue to review how the Constitution is viewed and some of the most debated parts of it, what have you found?
Well, thank you very much, Naledi. As Manager of Constitutional Advancement, my job is to understand, cognizantly so, that this Constitution that we have is the product of compromise and negotiation. It is not a perfect document. It is susceptible to being amended. Indeed, it must be amended. It is imperfect and must be perfected. Now, you're right. There are a number of provisions in the Constitution which have been a hot topic for debate that could and probably should be amended. Now, my colleague says the preamble. I don't want to go so far as to say that the F.W. de Klerk Foundation supports the amendment of the preamble for two reasons. Firstly, the preamble and then Section 1 of the Constitution, which lays out the founding values of our republic, and the Bill of Rights, which follows after that in Section 2, these lay out who we are as a people, the values of freedom and dignity and equality. But secondly, because it would require 75% of Parliament to amend the preamble, which at this stage in time with a fragmented Parliament is simply not possible. So what do we want to see changed? Yes. Here's the thing. I think the debate, and you mentioned what difference would there be from 10 years ago to today? We have a very bloated cabinet, right? Section 91 allows the president to, well, select ministers at his pleasure, but puts no cap on it. Let's reduce the size of the government. Section 22 of the Constitution, that says freedom of trade. Well, how can you have freedom of trade if you have these super monopolies like Eskom? I think there should be decentralization there. The Constitution makes no mention of monopolies. Well, what else? Let's professionalize the public service, the civil service. That strikes at the heart of Section 195 of the Constitution. Well, what else can we do? I think there are a number of things. The one thing I do agree with my colleague with is direct democracy. Section 46(1)(d) of the Constitution says that our electoral system must result in general in proportional representation. I think it would be great, especially with the work that the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel is doing, to introduce a mixed-member proportional system. But let's go further. Let's allow the Constitution to be amended so that we directly elect our president. These are the things that we at the foundation are calling for.
Okay, a lot of similarities. Very interesting. And we're going to open up the lines in a moment. In fact, let's put those numbers up, 010-5946-010. Do you believe that the Constitution represents the interests of all South Africans? Where does it have its shortfalls? And perhaps where would you like to see amendments? Send us a WhatsApp on 072-110-5584. We're also joined by Professor Eddie Maloka, who is an author and an academic who's been very outspoken, Prof. Maloka, about the sort of changes that we need to do at a constitutional level. In fact, you've gone as far as to say that we need to have an overhaul. Perhaps you can explain what that would look like. But you've also said that that would lead to a second republic. What would that mean?
No, the point really that I was trying to make, and it really fits in very well with what the colleagues on this panel have been saying, is that the Constitution, as it was done into the 1990 negotiations and resulted in what was adopted subsequently, it's a reflection of the negotiations and of also the concerns of that time. But 30 years later, a lot has changed. Some of the issues that were there were no longer there. Some of the controversies that were there are no longer there. But we still have quite a number of unfinished business. The future of provinces, our local government, and people are raising here the issue of direct elections and unaccountability in the elected representatives, and so on and so on. And my problem is that the approach that we seem to be taking is one of piecemeal reforms, this and that, and reforms that are, you could say, that are left to our very capable, perhaps, parliamentarians to do it. So me, I'm a proponent of that we must overhaul the entire system and looks at what works, what no longer works, and what is relevant today, and what other institutes we need. We still need provinces, etc., etc. And on top of that, it should not be left to parliamentarians to decide which goes to where. It should go to a referendum. So that's really my approach. But I do agree with quite a number of proposals that are put here. But I think a piecemeal approach is useful, but I don't think it's going to solve our problem. We'll be back to where we are now a couple of years later, discussing another section, then another section, then another section ad infinitum. So I think that we really need to look at the entire South African dispensation that we put in place in 1994 and say what is still working, what is no longer working, and then really develop a constitution, or really may introduce amendments that are intended to address some of the things that are no longer working. And one of them, of course, are provinces. I don't think provinces are still necessary. We need a different configuration of our system.
Big ideas, because an overhaul of the entire constitution, how much time would that take? What would that mean? How do we shape that? Especially when you've got Professor Maloka saying, well, let's also do away with the provinces. Keen to hear your views, and of course we'll get our panel to respond to that. You've got parties like the MK Party, for instance, who've said that our constitution is Eurocentric and does not embrace African or indigenous legal systems, that it is leaning too much on Roman Dutch law. A big conversation, but when we make submissions to the annual review process of it, as Parliament is then running, how do you make some of those contributions? What do they look like when you write to that review panel? Taking your call, 010-594-6010. Take those calls on the other side of this. Welcome back. All right, we continue our discussion as we see the Constitutional Review Committee inviting public submissions on the annual review of the Constitution. But in democratic South Africa 2025, what would some of those submissions really look like when we talk about some changes or amendments to our Constitution? One of our panelists, Professor Eddie Maloka, here says, let's not have piecemeal amendments. Let's have a complete overhaul of the Constitution as it stands. And our other panelists saying, well, there are some areas that we could actually zoom in on. I'm keen to hear what they are for you. Let's take some calls. Anonymous is in Katlehong. Anonymous, good evening. Thanks for calling.
How are you?
I'm well, sir. Talk to us. We're listening.
Yeah, the Constitution, according to my understanding, is working only for the black and white who stays in the suburbs. As we are staying in the location, I don't think it's working for us. For example, you've got these illegal spaza owners who are from outside. They are selling to us rotten food, right? The government, and the municipal and the subs, they came to do inspection to these spaza shops. But the problem is when they come here, they don't do what they're called to do. They speak to these guys, and then somewhere there they go to the corners, they take bribes, they don't arrest these people. I know this thing, it happened on the other side of Vosloorus, near Mastwalisane High School. I was there. The SAPS people were there with the municipal people. They were supposed to arrest these guys because they didn't have permits and they're selling rotten food. So that is why I'm saying this constitution is only working for the people who live in the suburbs, because in the suburbs there is no spaza shops. It's only, you'll find those retail stores, those who are selling right food. So it's us in the location that we are struggling. The last one.
Yes.
The last one. We are staying nearby the malls here. There's a mall here, they call it Semntuli Mall. If you go to Semntuli Mall, there is no humps. It's the only straight road. Cars are coming, flying each and every day. And there's squatter camps on the opposite. There's a hostel. There's RDPs on the other side. But the mall is very busy. But the cars are flying, like you can see that you can think, is this a freeway or is a place whereby these people they were supposed to drive 40? But it seems like there's no one who's taking care of us.
Yeah,
even the mayor of Ekurhuleni, he doesn't visit this place.
Yeah,
yes,
an important point, because that sort of hazard obviously could cost, and I imagine is costing lives, an important element that needs to be protected by our communities, by our leaders. Anonymous and Katlehong, we appreciate that. Let's take a look at some of the WhatsApps that have come in from our viewers. Of course, we're asking, what constitutional amendments would you request? Chanki says, land grab clause should be clarified because most people believe they can invade a particular land and use it without following the necessary procedures. It also affects businesses and business confidence, such that there is a belief that a group could just attack businesses under the pretense of a land grab to loot. Chanki. And get up the important point, I think, around understanding the Constitution. Pat Mashishi in Pretoria says changes need to be made. Prisoners' rights. South Africa belongs to all who live in it and return to corporal punishment. Okay. Princey, I see you nodding there. You've got someone agreeing with you on the matter of that preamble in South Africa belonging to all who live in it. Mas Mwadira in the Free State says scrapping of the participation of political parties from JSC in the interviews and recommendations of appointment of judges to maintain a complete separation of powers and maintain the independence of the judiciary. Interesting. Thanks for that, Moss. Thank you. Siputi says, good evening, Naledi. I fully support the review of our constitution, but not yearly. Instead, every 5 years, I need to see the electoral system being changed. We need to vote for an individual, not the party. The clause that says South Africa belongs to all who live in it must be changed. Everyone has their own country. It cannot be free for all. Our borders must be strictly protected. Okay, let's get more commentary from our panelists. Professor Kotza, let's bring you in. You've got the political party, the MK party, that enters the political fray and is able to really disrupt, how the poll results have looked in the country for a very long time. And one of the points that they make is that our Constitution is influenced by Roman Dutch law. You've got Professor Eddie Maloka who says, overhaul the entire system. The question I ask is, how? And is it something that is feasible, plausible?
Yeah, I think what Professor Maloka says represents very much a strong sentiment that does exist in South Africa. And that is that it is, in a sense, the Constitution of today is a product of its time. And that since over the past 30 years, obviously many things in South Africa have changed. I think that it goes back to, the understanding of a constitution and the function of a constitution within the state. And there are two schools of thought. The one is saying that the constitution should just provide the basics, the basic principles, the basic structures of the state, and that it does not enter into issues about policy, about public policies. The other view is exactly the opposite, to say that the Constitution must provide as much detail as possible, and therefore that it does not depend on who's the governing party or who's the government of the day, they are, in a sense, prescribed by the Constitution what to do. The South African Constitution is, in a sense, a bit of a mix of the two, but it leans towards the idea that the Constitution is less of a policy prescriptive document and more of a principle-based one that provides for example, Chapter 2, which is the Human Rights Charter, as well as the prescriptions of how the three arms of the state should be looked like. And that's the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, as well as then the public service. That means that if you go for the one that says that there must be as much detail as possible, then it also means that the Constitution will have to be amended very often in future, because circumstances change, policies change, governments change, and with that also they will have different approaches to what they want to implement and their vision of society. While a constitution like the one that we have now is one that accommodates different, or is supposed to accommodate different policies of different parties. Like, for example, now we have a government of national unity, which is different from the government predominantly of the ANC for the first 30 years. But it can accommodate this change in government without having to change the constitution. And I think this is the choice that the public of South Africa will have to make. Do they want to see a sort of a policy-based constitution, or that they want to have more of a principle-based constitution? I personally tend to support the latter, and that is that we should not have very often constitutional changes, because the reason for that is that the constitution is supposed to be the highest authority in the land. And therefore we have at the same time the Constitutional Court, which we haven't touched on yet.
Yeah.
The Constitutional Court is a very important mechanism in order to deal with how to understand the Constitution and what is possible in the Constitution, and also how to reinterpret the Constitution when it is necessary. And that we have seen with constitutions that are, for example, the US Constitution is more than 200 years old. And the Supreme Court there is the one that reinterprets the Constitution over the years. So the same, for example, with this idea about the electoral system. Our Constitution just talks about general proportionality. It does not prescribe any form of electoral system. It does not prescribe the current system of proportional representation. The Constitutional Court in 2020 actually interpreted that it can also include individual or independent candidates. And I think this is the role of constitutionalism in South Africa and other parts also.
Yeah.
It is, in a sense, a living sort of area, and it depends very much on something like the Constitutional Court to see how to understand it and how to apply to the current conditions.
You know, during the ad break, Prof, we talked about whether or not South Africans are actually engaging on the Constitution as many times as they should. We had a WhatsApp that talked about whether people understand what's in that Constitution. And Prof Kotza earlier saying that, well, this process that we see unfolding in the National Assembly as well as the NCOP in previous years has not actually yielded much change to, you know, regardless of the submissions that have been made. And I wondered if that is because as South Africans, we don't talk about it. There is at the beginning of administration, we watch our leaders pledge to defend and uphold the Constitution. Is that why this conversation becomes difficult to have, Ismail?
You know, sections 59.1 and 72.1 of the Constitution call for public participation. When we look at the various pieces of legislation in the pipeline, and when we look at the amount of people actually participating not just in legislation, but actually understanding another piece of legislation, which is the Constitution 1996, it's pitiful, especially with the Constitution. I think we've given the Constitution an aura of untouchability to an extent that probably stems from people, the citizenry in South Africa, not adequately engaging with the Constitution, not adequately understanding the Constitution. And I think young people particularly don't understand the Constitution. Now, once you understand the Constitution, you see that the Constitution, as we've been mentioning throughout this conversation, is a living document. It can be interrogated. It shouldn't simply be upheld. It should be made into a living reality for the people. And this is what we at the FW de Klerk Foundation believe. We believe that the Constitution is not just there to be upheld, it's there to be made into a living reality. Now, Prof. Kotze touched on something very important. It's that because we have a Constitution that's largely principle-based, and not so focusing on the specific principles or policies that should be in legislation. Because of that, we find ourselves now in a situation where policy that's amended cannot simply then mean that there must be an amendment to the Constitution every single time. And because we have a principles-based Constitution, and going back to what my colleague said here, when we speak about something like South Africa belongs to all who live in it, when we look at the preamble of the Constitution, that's simply because of the fact Chapter 2 of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, applies to every human being who resides within the borders of South Africa. Even immigrants, illegal immigrants as well, they have certain rights. Now, one of the anonymous callers asked the question, why are there so much cars down my road who cause so many deaths? Why are there so much spaza shops selling illegal goods to people in nice? That will not be found in the Constitution. The Constitution will not mention that. That's policy, that's directed by specific policy, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land to which all legislation must be held to. I think the Constitution as we have it is a great policy, great value set that we have. It should be looked at on a regular basis, but more importantly, we must make sure that politicians who uphold the Constitution uphold it by making it a lived reality for the people.
Yeah, by legislating.
By legislating.
And executing.
That's it.
I want to take more calls, but you mentioned the call from Anonymous, and Princey, you can help us with this in a moment. That misunderstanding of how it impacts me and my community, perhaps it speaks to the fact that South Africans simply can't understand it, and we want to go back to that. So when you make a call out to social media, and you can perhaps start to get the thoughts together, do people actually understand what the document stands for? We'll get to that. Let's quickly take a call, though, from Mohapi in Bothaville. Mohapi, good evening.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, Ndata, thank you so much for calling.
Yes, ma'am. I'm glad I see the viewers complaining about the South Africans. They don't have freedom because most foreigners are here in South Africa. They are here in South Africa because of that law that says South Africa belongs to all those who live on it. I'm so sorry. I'm not xenophobic, but those foreigners, they mess up our country. They mess up our country. They didn't even respect our constitution. And I'll be happy if they can change. For South Africa, South Africa belongs to all those, not those who live on it. South Africa belongs to their citizens, South Africans.
Okay.
South Africa for South Africans.
Okay. Mohapi, thank you so much for that. You've touched a nerve and opened a can of worms there, Princey. But we're going to continue with this discussion. Time's certainly flying. But we'll get some thoughts from our guests this evening on whether or not this Constitution does represent all South Africans and how we need to certainly get it there on the other side of this. Welcome back. Of course, we're getting commentary from our panel on the Constitutional Review Committee, calling for public submissions on the annual review of the Constitution. We're keen to hear from our viewers. What are the amendments that you would make to the Constitution? Taking calls, Vincent is in Centurion. Vincent, good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Yes, thanks for calling.
Yes. I would like to, my comment is about South Africa. Since we have then, our constitution established then, one of the very problematic thing is the murderers. People are murdering. They just don't know and even think there's consequences that are beyond anything. So we need to twist our constitution such that it does not give the murderer the right to have the right in life when they took people's lives. We need to then give them what is due to them. If you take someone's life, something is due to you. Because constitutionally, someone that is now gone and been killed by the murderer, is not being protected. Once you're dead, you are on your own, you're gone. This one would have to look after them. We have to spend 15,000 rand a month looking after them. It's completely wrong. We need to coin it such that those ones in particular and the drug dealers get their bit. This country is not moving forward as a result of this problematic thing.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Chapter 2 of the Constitution, and it reads, everyone has the right to life. Vincent saying, well, if you've committed murder, we should take that away and you shouldn't. Very interesting. Princey, you're doing incredible work, and I'm keen to hear, you make those calls and just the kind of things that you're hearing. But before the break, I'd asked about access. Number one, are people able to access the Constitution? Are they understanding it? And how do we fix that?
Now, lady, people of South Africa do not understand the Constitution. If you can see the comments I've been getting, people have been proposing things. I think the professor mentioned that the Constitution is not detailed. People have been proposing things that do not fall under the scope of the Constitution. We have acts under Constitution in South Africa. So people don't understand, and I feel that our government is not doing enough to educate people about this very important document. They should be doing public hearings, going around. This thing should be big, because this is a constitution that is for people, that is supposed to be for people, that is supposed to protect people. And the last thing I want to say, I agree with Vincent, the caller who just said, you should not have the right to life if you take someone's life. And that's why, as the South Africans for Constitutional Reform, we are calling for capital punishment for heinous crimes such as murder and serial rape and others. But also the last thing I want to say is that we do not want to shut everyone out. This is not about shutting out people, but this is about rebuilding the promise of the democracy. We want a constitution that prioritizes citizens, that listens to its citizens, because that's how you build both dignity and development of this country.
Yeah. I want to just go around the room and just close off with these thoughts. Professor Maloka, to our viewers that are watching this evening, and I say to you, the Constitution as it stands, does it represent the interests of all South Africans? Just as briefly as you can, how would you answer that question?
No, of course, it is an attempt to represent the interests of the of South Africans, or the majority of. The question is it still relevant in its entirety? And the question that seems to come across in this debate is that certainly not, that some of its provisions needs to be revisited. And when I was saying overhaul, it doesn't mean that like throwing out everything. You could still retain 80-90% of it, but you need to do some sort of an audit, and not a piecemeal approach that we are taking where we have a crisis, then we want to address this, but really to look at the entirety of the Constitution and say this works, this doesn't, but go through also a bottom-up approach rather than leaving it to our MPs to be the ones who are debating provisions and changing this and have very specialized bodies. We really need to get South Africans involved in this whole exercise, in the review, and also in the adoption of the changes that we want to see in the Constitution. So that's why I think that the referendum is better than just a debate among parliamentarians.
Interesting. Thank you so much for your time. Prof. Kotze, your final thoughts. You talked about how the Constitution is supposed to accommodate the interests of different political parties, but does it represent, I know now I'm asking you to step out of your realm as a political analyst, but does it represent the views of different sectors of our society, so all South Africans?
Well, I think what we hear a lot is that people who are poor, people, especially in rural areas, believe that the Constitution don't address their needs, that it is not sufficiently developmental in its approach, that it is also not sufficiently transformational, especially when it comes to with issues like, for example, land ownership, or whether it is about how to have access to issues like, for example, housing or accommodation, or to other fundamental needs of all the people of South Africa. Some accuse it of saying it does not attend enough to the economic dispensation in South Africa. That's why they ask about the possibility of economic CODESA, an economic transformation or negotiation process. So indeed, there are different opinions and there are different views about to what extent it really encapsulates all the main visions, the main aspirations of all South Africans.
Okay. I'm glad that we've got some of the younger voices here in studio, because I'm going to ask the same question to the both of you. And Ismail, I'll let you go first. Does it represent all South Africans? And then what do we do now?
Naledi, when I started off, I said that my role as manager of constitutional advancement is analyzing where we are, where we need to be. Does the Constitution reflect that? Will it take us there? The fact that we have these annual reviews of the Constitution and call for public participation is a metric and a measure in and of itself of what the views of the people are. This is why we at the FW de Klerk Foundation support it. Where we were in 1994, 1996, when the Constitution was brought to its, what we call the final version of the Constitution, which isn't the final version, represented the views of the majority of South Africans back then. But where to now? Where to in the next 30 years? I think we need a frank and honest, open conversation and open dialogue about whether the Constitution reflects the values of all South Africans. And this is why the FW de Klerk Foundation is so proud to be participating in what's now become known as the National Dialogue, endorsed by both President Mbeki and President Ramaphosa, so that we can have these difficult conversations, so that it can guide us on these constitutional review mechanisms and so forth.
Oh, that's going to be really an important moment for the country. Princey, I'll let you have your final thoughts. Same question, your assessment of whether or not it represents everybody, but what we do about it. And I'm going to actually give you the platform to, as you have been doing on social media, motivate for people to make those submissions.
Naledi, you know, when I was reviewing the Constitution, I was looking at constitutions of 5 different countries, South Korea, US, one African country. I also looked at India's constitution, Australia, just to be sure that whatever that we are proposing is constitutional. The Parliament does not come back to us and say we could not take these recommendations forward because they are unconstitutional. So we made sure that they are constitutional. And not even a single constitution out of those 5 that I reviewed said their countries belong to just anyone that lives in it. It says it belongs to its own citizens. So that's not unconstitutional, and it can be changed. And as you have heard from the callers, they all want that to be changed. And when it comes to the petition, I'm happy to announce that we have reached 12,000 signatures. I mean, this is the petition that we launched like 4-5 days ago, and we're now sitting on 12,000. So I encourage everyone to sign the petition. Please follow me on social media. I'm everywhere, on X, on Instagram, on TikTok, on LinkedIn. Follow me, get the petition link. Please share it and get everyone else to sign so that we fight for our country.
Sure. All right. Interesting perspectives this evening and such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists. Professor Eddie Maloka, who is an author and academic. Thank you so much to Professor Dirk Kotze, who is a political science professor at UNISA. Ismail Jessup, who is manager of constitutional advancement at the FW de Klerk Foundation, and Princey Mtombeni of South Africans for Constitutional Reform.